So this is a session organized by the Data Versioning Interest Group with a title Revisiting the Versioning Principles, the Road to Actionable Recommendations. So we welcome everyone, but especially welcome newcomers. So because we might have people new to this group, I will shortly give introduction of this group. But it's a little bit logistics. So this bit.ly link there is to collaborate notes. You can also scan the barcode to get into these notes. Please put your name and affiliation in the notes. And if you you can put down why you are interested in this data versioning topic. If you have any questions about the presentation or the topic in general, you can put that in Zoom chat for people online, and or collaborative notes for people in the room as well. So here is an agenda for this session. So I will give a quick introduction of the group for the benefit of the newcomers. And then we will have Jens. He unfortunately will not be here today, but he recorded his presentation, introduced the data versioning principles. The original data versioning principle is based on the software revision principle, and also the FRBR model. That's a functional requirement for bibliographic records. Is well-known model for library community. So we feedback got the last plenary is the FRBR model is complex and complex for managing library record, then even more complex for research data. So people in the room suggest to use BibFrame, another data model for bibliographic records. So we take suggestion on board and just improved the principle a bit. And then we will have two presentations. We will have two different use cases. We will have a Kirsten Elger from German Research Center for Geosciences to talk about the data versioning story from researchers' perspective. And then we will have Leslie. She is joining us online. She will give a very different user story, how data production centers to handle data versioning. And then we will leave enough time for discussion and get your feedback, how we can move here forward. Okay, introduction to the group. The group had a BOF session in 2016 in Denver. So we have a bit studied long ago. So the BOF was trying to gather interest. Should we the documenting data versioning and communicate that change in the version? So the interest was there. So we started the interest group. From interest group, we identified when people talk about versioning or version release, talking about different languages. So first we need to come to common terminology when we talk about versioning. So that's motivation to start a working group, because a working group has a specific purpose to achieve. It has a time limit, 18 months. So we had that in purpose. We studied a working group. Then forward in 2019 October. So we finalized the output of that working group. And then, so the principle, so is still at a high level. So there was interest, people wanted to have actionable recommendations, how to implement that principle. And then, so working group was translated to an interest group in 2020. Since then, we have been trying to develop these actionable recommendations. So here is the working group's output. So here is the here is a report of the introduce the principles, but the more concise the version of that is published in Data Science Journal. And another output of this working group, we at the time we collected about 39 use cases from different data centers, data repositories, and also from different resources, not just necessarily the repository. So we, based on this use case, we identify what are the common issues when people talking about the data versioning. So next, yes, we are talking about this identify the common issues from the use cases. So the interest group, we have a case statement. It is state 3 specific goals. So first is to promote the data versioning principles, but also we when we promote that, we get feedback and then revise as well. And secondly, is to develop recommendations for the adoption of the data versioning principles. And thirdly, and this is the forum for us who care about these issues to discuss the issue that's related to data versioning, data publication, mirroring, and also data versioning also cover the data attribution and the reward, because different people involved different stage of version revision. So how we could attribute and credit those who put effort into that. For the objective for this session, we will get a feedback from the presentation and also communication of data versioning principles. We also discuss new use cases. Then we will get your feedback. What you would like this data versioning guideline, look like? How could that work for you? Okay, so that's the introduction of the group. Is there any questions? Is there any question online, Kirsten? No.
I think we only have Leslie.
Okay.
No, there's no one online. It's just me. So I won't ask any questions.
Oh, they're new. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I'm sorry. I will check where they are.
No, it's only. I'm the only external person.
There are no.
Yeah, we except for the technique and then Ming-Fang and myself and the IDW. Yeah.
Okay, that's easier to monitor the online participation. we still have plenty of time for discussion anyway. So if you think of any question, comments, we can deal with that later. So move on. Now we have a recording from Jens Kron, and he will introduce the data versioning principle. We play the video. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to this data versioning session at RDA Plenary 21. I want to give you a quick overview of the data versioning principles, a proposed simplification of the principle, and a possible path to actionable recommendations. In 2021, we published our data versioning principles. They were based on 39 use cases, and we used concepts from software versioning as well as the functional requirements for bibliographic records as a conceptual framework. For this, we developed 6 foundational principles and introduced the concept of the full path of data. It is important to know that nowadays, it is very rare for research to be based on a single data set collected in just one campaign. So we needed to develop a terminology that allows us to define what we mean when we talk about a version. At Plenary 20, we got the feedback from the community that the Ferber model was seen as being too complex. It was suggested that we use the BibFrame model instead. The BibFrame model has the work as the conceptual entity that represents the intellectual or creative work. The work then has an instance, a published form or medium in which it is manifested. The instance of a work is made available as an item, which is the actual copy that is made available to you either as a physical or virtual object. The proposed changes do not change the fundamental concepts of the data versioning principles. We still have the concept of revision to describe how to identify change in a digital object. We have the concept of release to describe the data production process and communicate the significance of a change. We still have the concept of granularity to identify collections of objects, time series, aggregates, and so on. We have changed the terminology from manifestation to instance to identify different formats of the same work. So this is the change between Ferber and BibFrame, but it's the same idea. And we can still describe provenance through the relationship element in the BibFrame framework to tell us how an object was derived from a precursor object. The data versioning principles address critical needs in data versioning. Unambiguous identification of datasets enable us to identify the authoritative source and identity, which also supports the ethical sharing of data and allows us to recognize the contributions of different parties in making this data available. The principles support the reproducibility of research and data quality. For the actionable recommendations, we are looking forward to hearing about other needs in data versioning. Now that we have the data versioning principles, we need to translate them into actionable recommendations. The current data versioning principles are based on a collection of 39 use cases contributed by members of the community and document current practices from data providers. In our analysis, we identified some issues and inconsistencies of data versioning practices. What constitutes a new release of a dataset and how should it be identified? What is the significance of the change from one version to the next? Do changes in the metadata change the version of this associated dataset? How should a version be named or numbered? What version information should be included in a data citation? The task for the data versioning interest group is now to translate the data versioning principles into actionable recommendations. This is a task for this interest group or perhaps a working group. And the recommendations will need to take into account the established best practices and specific requirements of different user communities. Thank you for joining us today for the session, and we are looking forward to hearing about your versioning use cases. We are also looking forward to working with you on the actionable recommendations for data versioning.
That's the end of recording of Jan's presentation. Let me move forward. All the slides is available. The link is in collaborative notes. So that's the introduction of the data versioning principle. And now we come to the presentation of 2 use cases. The first, we will have Kirsten to tell us data versioning stories from the long tail.
Okay, thanks for this opportunity. I'm also co-chair of this working group, and I chose the title because everything or many things we have done within this working group are very high level, and as I'm working at a data repository for geosciences data with a strong focus on the long tail of data, in close contact with researchers, we have direct communication ways to say, okay, we all know that data that is assigned with a DOI must not change, but there are cases where the data needs to be changed. Sometimes they discovered later that they have sent me a wrong version, so not the final modeling output, but like a previous version, so they want to have it corrected. Or they have additional data that are added on a regular basis. And all of our communications are often about versioning, and we do not require a new version if we just add another year to a time series in the very same format. But when we change something, we have to have a version. And I would like to show you, and we're also part of the use case of this working group. We have 2 approaches, and just to show you where we are. So we have this focus on the long tail, but we also serve large projects, international services in geodesy and geophysics. So we also have DOI minting services for larger groups. And of course, we all look into standardization, rich metadata, etc. pp. Okay, so GFZ use cases. I started off saying we talk to the researchers. So they come, oh, there's something odd. What do we do? Can I update my data? We do not make a new version when there's a metadata update, including when people say, look, my data have been cited with another paper. I'm happy to add it because you always see the latest change. We do make versioning when we have a new data product. So when the data themselves change. This is an example I just illustrated for one of our global gravitational models. And it actually happened half a year after the DOI has been published that they discovered, oh, good, they didn't send me the final version. Because this Eigen 6S4 gravitational model is internationally used as one of the most used models for topography, for maps, for everything, even beyond Germany, it was clear that we cannot just exchange the data. Also because it has been published as like half a year ago. At this case, we have decided, and you see the 2 different numbers of DOIs, we have decided to use a second version of the same DOI, and there are dedicated spaces in the data site metadata. For example, whenever we can use the old one got a new metadata element is previous version of, and internally to make it visible to the users, because how would they know that there is a new data unless they're really pointed with their nose on it? So whenever I use the is previous version of metadata property, this little squares is appearing and say, okay, there is a new version. Please go there if you want to have the latest version. We also, of course, add the relation to the new version of the DOI, and we always ask for a version history. No matter what we do, we want to have it transparent and it's included in the metadata. So the metadata update for this new version is really on the original data set and on the other one. It is very clear that this approach is not machine scalable for thousands of data sets, but as we are working in the long tail with many researchers, this is like what they feel comfortable with. The other use case is related to our environmental monitoring program, Tirreno, where we provide DOIs for time series of climate station data since 2011. And we usually added the annual data every year. So there was always a new file for these data. Then the user said, you know, it is such a lot of work because actually the files were not fully standardized by the researchers. I would have loved to have them all standardized, to have a data type registry so we can make sure we have these standardized tables. But then sometimes there was a new sensor, so they added a column to the existing data. And then they had some regular reassessment on the metadata, on the data quality. But for the user perspective, for a person who is interested in including these metadata as in situ data for climate modeling, for any other data, they said, I'd rather have one file with 11 years. And the next year I have one file with 12 years or 13 years, than to be obliged to just make this mix and putting everything together, especially when they're not fully standardized. So we agreed with this group that we make, and they didn't want to have a new DOI, okay? So what we do, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a way in the metadata of DataCite where you can say title, blah, blah, version, whatever. So with this group, we agreed to keep the same DOI, keep the same publication year, because per definition of DataCite, the publication year is the year since the data was or is publicly available. This definitely has been, or like at this time, we minted the DOI in 2018. So this is when we had released this new version, but every other version is still having the publication year of 2018. We have, of course, because we really exchange the data. So when you go to the data download folder, you will find every file of the new version and a subfolder with the previous version. And this previous version, whenever we make a new version, we zip everything, all the different files, the changelog, the description, the data files, and the metadata into one zip file with the name version 2.2, version 2.3 for further reference. And of course, we have our version history saying, this is the current version, these are the changes, and here you find more information. And most importantly, you find every other version in the previous versions folder. And if I can, like, somehow, we have these discussions very often, and I wonder, the preference for either option is highly variable. So I wouldn't say this is our favorite version. Sometimes users say, no, but we have already put the DOI in the paper. I don't want to change it because the paper is published and I don't want to have it. If you look at the citation, and this is just, I highlighted in red the differences between the versions. So in one, you really have a new DOI and you have a new version on the use case 1, and on the use case 2, we have the same DOI. I don't know why this is bold, but shouldn't be, but we only count up the version of the data. And preparing this with individual researchers, I can assure that everything works fine. However, if we go to more automated systems, for example, the self-service, I have an example from Zenodo that I'm showing in due course, but how many researchers are actually understanding the different version models and are able to use them? I'm also chief editor for Earth System Science Data, and we recently had a case where a group was saying, hey, we have an update of our data. Can we make a corrigendum to our paper? And then they sent us this, there was data on Zenodo, so they sent us this version 2 Zenodo, but they were planning, of course, to make more updates. So I said, why don't you use the collection DOI? And I would like to introduce you to this, because Zenodo, that is the new the new outfit of Zenodo. They have changed everything recently. And what they do is that for each upload, Zenodo is additionally minting a collection DOI. Okay. And why I want to have this. Okay. This collection DOI, if you know how to use it, always ensures that you come to the latest version of your data. Okay. They have these little boxes, and there you have the version. So you have version 1 with 1 DOI, and then you have the explanation, cite all DOIs. You can cite all versions by using the DOI, and that's another DOI. And this is very well described here. But if you go below, you see the citation of the first version. And I like to ask the question, how many researchers are aware of this functionality? And especially how many researchers know tools like citation cross-site to resolve a DOI to a citation? So I think knowing there are some ways Zenodo could improve, because you could either provide the citation of the collection DOI. If you know the thematic and the topic, it's perfectly understandable. But this is what I'm usually explaining to the researchers. And the use case the case I described before with this paper, I really had to make a call with the authors of the paper and say, listen, this is how it works. Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Please use that DOI, and this will always lead you to the latest version. So this is something what we have to keep in mind. And I think we have to do a bit more outreach and a bit more like education to the researchers to make them aware of what we do. And this is included in this actionable guidances, because we can not only focus on research infrastructures, but also on the people who are using them. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Question to Kirsten.
Hi.
Could you please say your name and affiliation? Thank you.
I'm Martin Weise from Technical University of Vienna. And I not really have a question, but more a comment. Because I also do this citation of specific versions, not the collection. Because for me, I at least assume it creates a problem when I cite the collection and the metadata, or data even changes in the background. It changes my reference.
Sure.
It changes my data that I maybe used for an experiment. So that's why I picked the version DOI, the specific version of the collection.
Yeah, and we are supposed to do so, because for papers we need to provide the data that is underlying your research results. But giving the use case of a living data paper, for example, what we have in our system science data, where we say, okay, we have described it for that version, but now we are regularly updating our time series, and as soon as we do it, Zenodo is automatically minting a new DOI. If they came to me, I would not mint a new DOI. I would mention it, okay, we plan to update this metadata, so then we have, okay, new version, date 1, whatever. So then the DOI remains the same. This would be more the use case too. And this is what's your last name, Lasse? No.
Weise.
Okay. So that's why, like, that's what people always say, no, I'd rather have the same DOI and then make sure that the version is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any comments and questions?
James Ada from British Oceanographic Data Centre in the UK. It's really interesting when you said you have the new versions, the new files, and it keeps growing and growing. Is there a concern about the sustainability of that in terms of space storage, if you're constantly having more and more data, and sort of the environmental impacts that potentially has?
You mean this Terreno use case? Lucky us, we speak about ASCII files.
Okay, so very small.
It is, yes. Otherwise, so, I would rather encourage people to not, because the only reason why we really exchange the files is that sometimes the quality flags are changing in the data files. Therefore, we cannot even. We have another case where we publish the KP index, which is the geomagnetic index, and this is officially published by GFZ, and this is really, we add the value every month. So, but we have internal workflows to ensure that's just a line, that's very tiny things, but they have annual updates, and there I really exchanged the data, but we have described it, and we have guaranteed that the original is not changing. That is, yeah. But yes, for small data, if we speak about big sensor data, never, ever. Okay.
Thank you, Kirsten. Now we move on different user story. We have Leslie Wybon online, and he will present from Canberra, Australia. Leslie, take it over.
Okay, so I'm going to go from one extreme to the other. Kirsten has talked about the long tail. I'm going to talk about using versions of data on a supercomputer at petascale, and why versioning becomes absolutely critical to keep track of what you're doing. Next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we pay our respect to the elders past and present. Next. Okay, so this 2030 geophysics project was an R&D project that amazingly got funded. And what we were trying to do was make national high-resolution geophysics data sets suitable for programming access in exascale HPC environments. Now, we're nowhere near exascale in our capacity in Canberra at the moment, but we wanted to explore whether there are any difficulties that were going to come out once we started to put the data sets that we needed to be careful of. And so what we were really doing was trying to position the geophysical data sets to be able to take advantage of the next generation computational infrastructures, which will be at exascale. Next slide, please. And so when you look at it, as you scale up, as you all know, you can increase your resolution, you can increase your model size. You really do speed up access to data and your processing times, and you can have more complex models. And this is kind of what we're saying is a different trend, to be actually thinking of trying to use your data sets at full resolution, because most people tend to, this day and age, think more about the delivery of the data, the presentation of the data, using images, GIS, online dashboards and decision support systems. So we were going the other way, and some interesting things came out. Next slide, please. So first of all, as Jens said at the start, it's really rare for, in the big data world, you don't just have one person collecting one data set, doing some processing and getting a result, so single processing. What we find is with big geophysical and satellite data sets, you have the raw data, then you go through the level 0, 1, 2, 3, where you're editing that raw data, you're transforming it and calibrating it to certain real world parameters, and then you can start to get keep processing and move to the models. And so level 2 and level 3 are mainly your data products. They're greatly reduced on the original size of the data, and they're what's put out in the general public. Next. So what we found when we started to get these data sets online is because the researchers could process it so quickly, they just kept creating more and more versions of the same levels of processing. And it was starting to get really hard to track what data sets were being produced and what their provenance was, particularly for provenance and traceability of the end product. And so we just loosely termed this vertical integration. As I said, being able to go from the models back to exactly which version of the data was used. So clearly the first thing we needed to do was to start to be able to put the instances of the data sets together according to the level of processing. Next. slide, please. And so, as I said, I tried using Ferber, but with BibFrame, I had a go at it. And I thought, I think this is going to work. And so I'll take you through how we applied it to try and keep track, not just of the number of versions of the data we were generating, but more importantly, paying attention to, you know, who owned that particular version and who created it. Next, please. And of course, going in at the deep end, this is a massive data set, and it's been going for about 8 years. So there's 3,000 sites across Australia, and at each site, the instrument, a hole is dug and the instrument's left there for 6 months. So the full time series data set will be petascale. And to analyse that, it needs to be co-located with HPC in Canberra. That is at the national scale, but you can imagine a researcher could use just a small subset of that data set locally. So, and that doesn't need to be next to the HPC, that can still stay out at the original geological survey that collected it. Next. And so what I said was, for the work was this massive OSLAMP project. The instance was whether it was the raw, the level 1, level 2, level 3 of the data set, and the items were the location of the product as to where that data set was being released from, and someone could get access to it. Okay, next slide. I hope you're still with me. And so I just want to take one subset, and this is what we call the Musgraves, which is fortuitously at the boundary of Western Australia, South Australia, and Northern Territory. Next. Oh, sorry, can you go back one, Ming? Is it possible? Sorry, I meant to say, so it's in the 3 states. It was collected by the University of Adelaide in collaboration with the Geological Survey. The Geological Survey South Australia archives it, but products are made available through the West Australian Geological Survey, the South Australian, and NCI in Canberra. So I thought, I wonder if BibFrame can help us distinguish the various versions, products, and access points. Next. And again, just refreshing you. So this is what we're trying to do, sort out all these different versions at different levels done by different people, and then to add it available from different sites. Next. And so we started out, as you see on the left, work, instances, and items. And the work is, I'm just going to call the work the Musgraves data set, which, as you can see on the right-hand side, sorry, I don't have a pointer, goes through to the Geological Survey South Australia, because, you know, this is their sovereignty. They really are the ones that own that data set. Okay. And then they were publishing the models over to your right, but the raw data set was too big. They could not get it out through their pipeline. So they moved it over to the Supercomputer Centre, where we then developed the raw level 0, level 1, and we made them publicly accessible from the NCI site. So they're items. Now, with the really interesting, what they call the EDI files, that's the level 2, that's the most commonly used format. That's what industry wants, and it's quite small and you can move it around. So that middle blue one is available from NCI, South Australia, and Western Australia. Okay, and then the models themselves are only available from South Australia. But you can sort of see how by doing this BibFrame map, we're starting to make sense of who's got what, but more importantly, who it was derived from and its provenance. And as Kirsten said, you can have each one of these having an individual DOI or PID, and particularly if you use DataCite, you can reference and say, this item was derived from this data set, this was derived from this. And so you're going to be able to go back up through that processing chain. But the important point is the BibFrame model allows you to group the level 0, level 1, level 2 data sets all together. Oh, sorry. Yeah, collectively agree, well, look, that lot are the same as, you know, they're all together, or these ones are the highly evolved products. Next. And this is kind of like showing you, we started out in the Musgraves, we went to South Australia, a copy went across to Canberra, and then the products are available from Western Australia, South Australia, or the NCI. Next. And so what we're arguing is that this is this complexity of a data set. The bigger data sets are rarely produced by one person, and the whole lot only available from one site. And so on the left-hand side, what we've got is the distributed data and compute resources at South Australian Survey and the West Australian Survey. But then we moved the really big volume data sets across to Canberra, to the NCI, so we could do the processing. And you can sort of see how this BibFrame work enables us to create a map and differentiate the different levels of processing, as well as the different products and versions of that. It's just a way of creating a framework to structure your data. I think that's it, Ming.
Thank you, Leslie.
Right, yeah, back to you.
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. Any questions for Leslie?
Thanks, Leslie. This is Matt Mernick from National Center for Atmospheric Research in the US. And actually, I have a question about this slide that you're showing here, which is all of these items and instances and so on. And my question is kind of just for clarification. Can you talk about the lateral relations between these, particularly on the bottom two levels? Are these, in some sense, equivalent versions, or, you know, version
Okay.
maybe is the wrong word, but equivalent instances, or are they, you know, component parts of a larger data set? Can you maybe just clarify that a little bit?
I haven't used
So-
the question. That's
So first of all, we get,
yeah.
yeah, Matt, we do get, there's debate as to whether these are versions or products, okay, but let's just use the word version. So if you start at the row called instances, right, we had the raw data, then we produced the edited time series, and then the transformed time series, right? What we were doing was exposing the raw forms of the data. As you move to the right, the two blue cells are from the South Australian Geological Survey. And that was what they could only make available because their infrastructure just wasn't capable of making accessible large volume data sets. We could have reprocessed and created our own, and we probably will create our own level 2 and level 3. But at the moment, it just means that a researcher can, if they want to just use the model, that's it. If they want to go back and create their own models or their own EDI files, they've got the chance to do that. Before we did this work, you could only take the work that was processed by Geological Survey South Australia to their parameters and their business case, all right? Now, when you come to the items, you can sort of see if we deal with the, sorry, I haven't got a pointer, but the blue instance on the first one, right? That's the most popular product, and it's available from 3 different sites. Now, theoretically, they're the same, but as you know, as you move data around, or maybe someone at GSSR, South Australia, updates their thing and doesn't tell the others. And so that's why we're saying these are actually separate items and should be treated as such. And in our versioning principles, we do advocate for an identifier, a different identifier, to be on a data set if it's at a different location, unless there's a very strong SLA between the originator of the product and the copy that is ensuring that the two are kept in sync. Because we're going for absolutely, rigorous transparency, chain of custody. And to us, you can't guarantee that something doesn't get changed. Does that explain it to you, Matt?
Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you. I think one of the challenges or almost dangers in some sense of using these bibliographic models is that they were really designed for, things like books, right? And they're pretty good at catching the issues related to sort of whole items. I think they sort of break down when you get to kind of these constituent part type situations. And so I think I appreciate how you've described this, and I think it makes sense, and I'm glad it's working. I think it's a good model. But that's always been my challenge with some of these models, is that the constituent part kind of connections that have lateral relationships don't get represented real well in some of these models like BibFrame or Ferber. Thank you.
Yeah, if you just go on to, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. I just want to go to the next slide. Yeah. The other thing, Matt, that we're trying to do is respect the Geological Survey of South Australia's sovereignty and make sure people know that the original data set was the initiative of the University of Adelaide and the Geological Survey of South Australia. And in these big data sets, that's so often what gets dropped off. Okay, sorry, Ming, what were you going to ask me?
I have another question on these slides. So where's the pointer? So, I wonder if there is a relation between level 2 and the level 3 to raw data.
Oh, yeah, sorry. All those, sorry. They all come from the same raw data, but I would argue the level 2 and the level 3, the level 2 and the level 3 come from a copy of the raw data, which is the one on the left-hand side. But what I was arguing is that the raw data was held with the Geological Survey of South Australia, and that was what we copied to NCI.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
The other thing to remember is, as I showed you, that people are creating, now they've got it on the HPC and they can process it quicker. There's a lot more level 1 products coming out and level 0, and it's just sort of like a shambles. And so we're trying to make sure people say is derived from, so that we've got the provenance, but above all, so that it always goes back to the funding by the University of Adelaide, Oscope, etc., to create this data set.
Thanks, Leslie. Any questions from the floor? No. So now we have 2 presentations of 2 different use cases. Now down to the discussion time about the developing actionable guidelines from the data versioning principles. If we flip back to the principles, just give sorry, too many. I have no control of that. This. Sorry. I'm getting there. Getting there. Here is the data versioning principles. First of all, does that make sense? Do you think any of those principles needed to be clarified? I know many of you probably see this first time. And for example, do you have first, is each of these principles clear to you? And secondly, think about your own use cases, say how did you do the version control and etc. Who's if I have people show hands up, see these principles first time. So we have probably half and a half people in the room see this principle first time, and have probably already seen that. For people, this is the first time. Do you think each of the principle makes sense, or do you make any comments?
Maybe a use case if they.
Yeah, you have any use cases, for example, how you apply the version control from where you are, and also how do you recording those problems, track the change between versions. Matt again.
Yeah, I'll comment again to get us going here. So Matt Marinick again from NCAR in the US. So within my organization, we have a number of different data management teams, and they kind of all do it a little bit differently. In some cases, versions are explicitly tracked. In some cases, they're somewhat, I don't want to say loosely tracked, but they change less often. In one of our teams, they have a database where they track precise relations between data set, which might be the kind of concept level Leslie was talking about, files, and then the identifiers. And any of those may change at different intervals. And so they have a database that tracks the connections between all of them. So for example, in some of the cases that you mentioned, Kirsten, the data set might stay the same, the identifier might stay the same, but some of the files may change. But then later you may change the ID because you have a different change. And so some of the files that were under the previous ID are now under the new ID. So there's a kind of a three-way relationship between the data set, files, and then the identifier. They may all change at different rates. So that's probably the most detailed. I think maybe in just a comment on what could be useful here. I think the paper that you've produced is already very good. And I think my experience is that kind of just tends to be decisions. At a certain point, you have to make decisions about how you're going to approach this. And so I think providing maybe a bit more guidance on considerations for those decisions, which would be based on these principles, that could be a useful point. Because I think it's very hard to derive hard rules for how to do things, but to provide guidance on how to make decisions, which I think is already in some of your documentation, is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Indeed, so those use cases indicate, the acronym, there are different organizations provided these use cases. You can see each of them doing different ways. And so here are the questions we gathered from those use cases. And so the data citation working group, they did nice work for, the track the changes and timestamp. So when user, use as a data set now into the future, if they give the timestamp and give the DOI, they are able to the data set, whoever implements that can reverse back to exactly data set they get. And that's nice work about the principle, give example of principle 1 revision, but then about the other 5 principles is more about how do you record that change? How can you tell the difference between version 1 and version 2? Should I, if user never know all these versions, so which one to pick up? So yeah, Kirsten.
What I'm just thinking on this topic is that to me, there are not yet standardized metadata fields in either of the standards that can be used to provide this version history. So maybe this could be something to bring into the DataCite metadata working group to say, okay, if we now speak about versioning of data and these recommendations have been implemented and acknowledged and by RDA, DataCite has quite some options for using descriptive elements. They have them abstract methods, table of contents, anything. Why not version history as a dedicated field? If this would be interesting, at least it would be not the overall solution, but for those of us who are using DataCite DOIs, we can at least make sure that this is included in the metadata and then also transferred into any other of these portals that are harvesting DataCite metadata.
Totally agree. So the proof model, you can link, say, different version, but does not give you detailed information.
Yeah.
What has been changed. Yeah. So where to record that change? That's yeah.
Well, in
Question.
databases, and I remember we have a metadata base for our GNSS data at Potsdam that is purely metadata. It's not data, but especially for GNSS data sets, it is extremely important to record any change of instruments because it automatically leads to a change in your data time series. And this is definitely with every version control and everything, but this is but this is the metadata. But then having a standardized way to record it would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. So software revision does that where every release they will report on what has been fixed, what's different from this version from previous version, but data is probably more at a nuance level that changes. Yeah. Any other comments from the floor?
Yeah, I do have one other.
Sorry, could you say your name and affiliation, then ask a question so people online know who you are?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. So my name is Eric Van Winkle. I work for a company called DSci Labs. We use a lot of decentralized web technologies to make next generation persistent identifiers. So the idea is, instead of a persistent identifier referencing a single point, it references a file structure through IPFS, the Interplanetary File System. But as a part of this, part of what I'm wondering is, what's your view on the interplay between persistent identifiers and concepts like data quality and data versioning is, and how we can potentially see some of that evolving into the future with newer persistent identifiers coming out?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Does anyone want to give a go? So how the question, let me rephrase that. How that persistent identifier could be related to data quality and use that to improve data quality. Yeah.
Leslie, she wants to say.
Sorry, you can use your microphone.
I'd just like to chip in. So Meg and I have been working with the ESIP data quality cluster. I'd kind of leave quality out of this for the time being, because basically we cannot get agreement as to what is the way of putting identifiers on a different version. So like I know one group in Australia that only puts one DOI on a collection regardless of what level of processing it is, what format it's in. And I think people are starting to realize, hey, whoops, we do need to get different identifiers on that. The more controversial aspect of what we're presenting here is that you actually put an identifier on different points of distribution of the same data set. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, can we sort out where we put identifiers on versions, which is again coming up with best practice. And then I think I'm not quite sure how you'd bring quality into it. Or the only other thing, sorry, which we have done again with the ESIP data quality cluster, is that we put identifiers on quality documentation that goes with the data set. And so if you look at, say, the work of IMOS, the Integrated Marine Observing System in Australia, for each data set they produce, they have 3 quality documents. The first is the specifications by which the data set is collected. The second is the test that is going to be applied to that data set to see if it meets the quality specifications. And the third document is the document that assesses the quality of the data set. So you know where all the holes are in the data set when you get it. So that's putting identifiers on quality documentation that goes with the data set. Is that what you are interested in?
No, I apologize. I probably shouldn't have brought data quality into that. That was my bad. More so what I wanted to know was the use of versionable identifier systems as a portion of data versioning practices, and how some of these emerging technologies are playing into the RDA working group's vision. So I apologize for the data quality question. The two are always interrelated in my mind, but definitely more of a versioning question.
Well, it is interrelated. You don't need to apologize. And so the data versioning, the process, you know, for some, does improve data quality. And so one version, say, have a bias in data or have some gaps, then improved in next version. So I would say, you know, my line would or be aligned to Leslie's is more in the documentation, in the metadata, you know, that so the PID itself point or identify an object, but what's in that object, that's in the documentation. Yeah. So that's probably PID's point too. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Any questions? Has anyone encountered any data versioning issue before? Or asked by, you know, if you how many of you come a data repository? So manage data repository. So 3 of you. And who are the rest? So, you know, and do you manage data or collecting data yourself, or have you encountered any like a data versioning issue before? So what's your interest in data versioning? Come on. Go my first, please.
Nobody else is going. I just spent the past week of my life trying to reproduce a paper from one of the researchers who I work with. Come to find out, he had given me the wrong data set. Even though it was pointed at with Zenodo, he had provided beautiful Python notebooks which detailed step-by-step instructions on how to go through reproducing his work. And it took me quite a while to figure out that the DOI issued, or that the data set underpinning the DOI was actually just the wrong version of the data set. And that's why I couldn't make it work. I think to a certain extent, data versioning, especially if we look into data publishing, is going to be such a critical aspect of cleanliness in the scientific record, just general basic hygiene. So I would love to see that, as I think it's an important part of reproducibility.
Well, I would like to chime in data curators. And this then, they would check before minting the DOI, ideally. Therefore, domain repositories are often recommended to these self-service things because, yeah.
Yeah, like
I have to say it,
Zenodo, everyone just put their data set in, have a DOI, then meet the publisher's requirements.
Yeah.
No curation there.
Well, it's funny the way that I figured that out. The data curator, I think they actually did their job. It was the
Yeah.
researcher who handled the GitHub
Yeah.
that had uploaded Python notebook changes afterwards. So the fact that all of these artifacts were fragmented and disparate just meant that people couldn't coordinate.
Mm.
It's a challenging
Well, just
problem.
having GitHub doesn't mean that it's a well-documented, organized software. Because
I agree.
and when I'm also minting DOIs for software, for our research software, and the most comment I make is, if you use a GPL license, please provide a copyright statement and a disclaimer. They are just not aware of it.
Thank
They
you.
send me software with CC BY license. They say, no, that's not a software license. We need. So I think this is where having someone to, and I would have overseen that too. But if you mention that to your researcher, why it couldn't it be possible that because it happens all over. I just had it for another data we published where someone was using it. I said, oh, there's an error. So the author came back, hey, we had an error. Can we make a new version? Certainly. And then we want a version history. Here we go. That's it. So that's where it's good to have people to contact, to ask questions, I think.
But you
can I just
you did touch on very important issue. We all doing this, keep track of version and the recording things is just, for one of major purposes for reproducibility. We didn't talk why we are doing that. Thanks. Leslie?
sorry, can I also chip in? Yeah, initially, well, sorry, for most of you, the first 20 years of my career, I was a scientist because there was no internet and no Excel and none of this data stuff. It was all done on cards and typewriters. But it's going back to my scientific days, and wanting reproducibility is why I'm pushing so hard for different copies of data, as we now call items, from different sources, even though they're theoretically supposed to be the same. They should have a separate DOI so that if anything goes wrong and you want to get your research, or you end up in a court case or something like that, then you can say, I used this copy of this data set at this date, and you've got the DOI for it. But at the moment, I do find that if I'm fighting the where do you put a DOI on a version, I'm still fighting groups that just say, oh, it doesn't matter what format it's in or what it's, it just should, the whole thing should just should have one DOI. And that means you've got no way of differentiating what format was used or what level of processing it was or anything. But there is a pushback from the community because they say, oh, it's too hard to manage DOIs and mint them at that granularity. And I also used to work on sample DOIs, and you sort of have 5 million samples. It's a matter of the researchers understanding they need to start being able to scale up the granularity at which they're minting these DOIs. And I guess that's where you're coming from. Maybe we should have something in these guidelines, which are recommendations on where and when to put a new DOI.
Thanks, Leslie. Any more comments?
This is Matt again. One general comment and then a question. So the comment is, I think some of what you were saying, I think, again, really points to the question of use case. I think your use case is really important and should be very explicit in guiding strategies for identification and versioning. As one of you, I forget who mentioned credit and sort of tracking credit or tracking authors of versions to assign credit appropriately. And that's a different use case than the sort of really fine-grained reproducibility that was just mentioned before. So there might be a different approach to versioning depending on what you're trying to do. The question I had, I guess, was if in the use cases, are they all focused on data? Or you've already mentioned software a few times, and I'm involved in a project struggling with some of these same questions around instruments and facilities. And so I'm wondering how broad your use cases are, or if you've considered having use cases that aren't only data. Thank you.
I don't know the use cases by heart, but I would definitely include software. But using Git is something that helps organizing. So it's using it properly requires some other skills, but there we can learn from versions. But also then, and that's interesting, one of our early software is a converter from one geodetic format to another one. They further develop it every other month, whatever. And after we have minted ADOI for citation purposes, and it was like 3 years later, they said, you still have version 1.2, we now have 1.15. And what we then decided for the DOI for citation purposes was to just remove the version and say, okay, this is for the object. And that's a similar approach to what the seismologists are doing with their seismic network DOI. They would never expect the identification of each file. What they do, at least at GFZ, and that's something I always think it's quite interesting, they identify their files with handle PIDs and they combine them to a network DOI. And this is possibly something we could look into it to just, because if you have a DOI, everything is in parallel. We might have internally structures like Zenodo does. They always link to the version of the collection, whatever. But if you look to the datasite commons, then you have these 100,000s of similar titles. Who is looking at these? Of course, we as humans, not as machines, but still it's something that I think it's increasingly interesting having the combination of PIDs depending on the granularity.
Complex data citation.
I know.
Yeah. When you brought the
but they have other ideas.
Attribution, it just reminding that Sherry is when I heard her talk about all this attribution, that's I think the version will be getting that attribution more complex. Then So so I don't know. So
me?
versioning, from so Leslie, I just finished my thing.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see it. Yeah.
Sorry. So so versioning, from version 1, you have say to version 10, you have a different people. So if you cite the version 10, do you need a cite way back to version 1? But I was thinking, as a researcher, I published paper, I reference 10 papers, cite 10 papers, cite 1 papers, and put that in my reference. But that paper also built on the knowledge of many other papers. So do I need to cite the other papers well, I cite? So how do you, what's the right word? So populate the instead of ask researchers to find all the chain in that pipeline, how the whoever doing this credit to come out the tools, how do you the populate from the top to the bottom, share that credit automatically? Yeah. Sorry, Leslie. You want to say
I'm just going to
something?
go back to Matt's question. One of the ironies of your question, Matt, is that Jens Recom, who was the leader on this work, based the data versioning principles on software. So theoretically, it should work for software. We just kind of didn't go near that because there seems so much going on with software versioning and no one was attacking data versioning. Now, I found your comment about instruments very interesting, and we also have a PIDS for Instrument group in Australia who would love to connect with what you're doing. Wow. I can sort of see, similarities in that, with instruments, a sensor drops off and you put a new one on, and there are versions of the instruments, but at the moment I'd probably keep those separate. But yeah, maybe you're right.
Okay,
It's
thanks.
the whole thing's going to come together into one versioning system, which will be related to where and when do you put a new identifier on something that is changing.
And thank you. Can you help me to advance my slides to last two? Otherwise, I will flip a lot. Thank you. So, okay, we about to come to the time. Let's come to, yeah. So, so what's next step for us? So we will continue the discussion of data versioning issue within the context of the this interest group, and still with a goal to develop recommendations to guide decision making on data versioning procedure, documentation, citation, and contribution. So it's not like standard or something to follow or something, but it's a recommendation. So we hope with the recommendation, we are more consensus about what we are doing about data versioning. So if you are not member of this interest group, you are welcome to join the group. If you are already a member of RDA, it's easy. Just to find the interest group, and you need to log into the RDA website, find the interest group. Just there is a big button there, join. And last but not least, you will see 4 of chairs, 3 of us are from Australia. So we need to have a more geographic spread of co-chairs. So then, and not just Jens, Leslie, and myself speak ourselves in Australia. And we, have a geographic spread. We'll get more ideas, more diversities, and, into the group. So if you are interested, just approach any 4 of us. So, yeah. So that's it. And thank you very much for joining us today. And yeah, we hope to get your feedback further. We document the collaborative notes still open. If we're shy to talk, just adding the document. Thank you very much.